we're going to have Catherine take us through the inclusionary zoning definition. She's also going to take us through the studies that the cities have done, and she's going to review some of the proposed policy direction at this point in time. So at the end of the 20-minute presentation, as I've said, we're going to have an opportunity again for further questions and clarifications. We can continue some of the dialogue that we've just had around the MTSAs, and then we can also address any clarification, or sorry, address any questions and points of clarification that you're going to have regarding inclusionary zoning. So Catherine, can you take us away?
Okay, great. Thanks, Erin. We can advance the slide, please. So thanks everyone for tuning in tonight. I'm looking forward to sharing our inclusionary zoning policy directions with you. Let's start by exploring the basic elements of inclusionary zoning. So what is inclusionary zoning? This is a tool that allows cities to require affordable housing units in new developments. So this means cities can create rules and regulations that will establish when and how a developer needs to provide affordable housing units in their development. The next question is where. So cities are not currently able to apply inclusionary zoning on a citywide basis. As Bashar has mentioned already, the inclusionary zoning tool can only be used in major transit station areas that are protected. So that means they've been adopted in our official plan with the necessary policies. MTSAs are areas where the city plans to accommodate significant future growth, and also areas where transit and services will be located to support that growth. The province is also directing that inclusionary zoning go to these high growth areas. Now, it is possible that the province may also direct cities such as Mississauga to implement inclusionary zoning in other areas. Next slide, please. So before we dive into the inclusionary zoning study and the status of our study, I want to set a little bit of context for inclusionary zoning, which really is one tool in our housing toolkit. So on the slide before you, you will see a housing continuum. This is a depiction of different segments of housing. So it's a way of understanding housing need across our population. On the very left-hand side, we have individuals and households that are experiencing poverty or are living in temporary accommodations such as emergency shelters and transitional housing. The next is social housing. This is permanent housing that's operated by either government or nonprofit housing providers, and it typically involves a government subsidy to ensure that the rent rates remain nice and low. These segments represent the greatest need in our population, so there are lower income individuals and households. Now, the region of Peel, who is the housing service manager in Mississauga, focuses a significant portion of their efforts, their funding, their programming and initiatives here on these segments of the housing continuum. And that's because it is the greatest need. Now, for our middle income households who earn approximately $58,000 to $109,000 in gross annual household income, the market housing, which is on the far right-hand side of the continuum, is becoming increasingly out of reach for them. And if we break that down further and we extract just our middle income renter households, these are households that are earning $34,000 to $64,000 in gross annual household income. So these households are all struggling to afford market housing, but they typically don't qualify for assistance that's targeted at our lower income households. So there's a gap there. And we're suggesting that inclusionary zoning mostly focus on creating units in this segment of the population, so below market rates that are affordable to our middle income households, to address this gap for our middle income households. Okay, next slide, please. So inclusionary zoning was first introduced by in Ontario by the province a few years ago, and since then there's been some changes to the legislation and it's more or less settled out at this point. We've actively been investigating inclusionary zoning and its potential in Mississauga and Peel region. We've been working with the region of Peel, who are also on the call tonight. Some staff from the region are on the call, as well as other local governments. So that's Brampton and Caledon in the region, to continue advancing inclusionary zoning. And so we'd like to share a study update with you. Next slide, please. So here's a study timeline, working from left to right on the screen. The first work component was a background analysis, and this is called an assessment report in the legislation. I'll speak more about this in a moment, but at this point, I'd just like to note that that background work has been completed. Then on January 24th, we shared our preliminary policy, January 24th of 2022, we shared our preliminary policy directions with Planning and Development Committee, which is a subcommittee of our City Council. And that's also why we're here tonight. We're here to share proposed policy directions and also clarify any questions that you might have about the direction that we're heading. We're working towards draft inclusionary zoning policies and regulations to be shared publicly in May of 2022. And final City Council adoption is targeted for the summer of 2022, so early July. And it's our intent that inclusionary zoning will start to take effect by the end of 2022. Next slide, please. So here's our inclusionary zoning study area, and Bashar has already shown you a map of our 54 major transit station areas within Mississauga. So those 54 MTSAs are marked on this map with orange dots. And then the blue area on this map is the inclusionary zoning study area. And it also shows the boundaries of those proposed MTSAs. So this is where we're investigating the potential for inclusionary zoning. So you'll notice that some MTSAs are not included in the inclusionary zoning study area. For example, if you can identify here Ontario Street, it's the vertical street in the middle of the city. The northern portion of this street is not part of the study area. And that's because this is an employment area, so the permitted uses in this area are not residential. So any areas across the city that are MTSAs that aren't planning for a significant amount of residential growth and intensification are not part of our inclusionary zoning study area. We've scoped it to areas where significant residential growth is planned. Next slide, please. So I did speak earlier about the background work that we've completed so far, also called the assessment report. There's three main components to this assessment report. The first is a housing needs assessment. And this is an analysis of demographics, income, housing supply and demand, and prices and rents. And the region of Peel completed this work initially in their 2018 housing strategy, and they also recently completed an update, basically a data update to that housing strategy, which addresses the housing needs assessment requirements for inclusionary zoning. Then the next big piece of work was the financial feasibility analysis. In partnership with the region, we retained a consultant, Enberry Lyon Consulting, or NBLC, and they undertook this market feasibility analysis. We tested sample developments in 10 different areas across the city, looking at the financial feasibility of these developments under an inclusionary zoning framework. And finally, the third piece of work is a peer review. This work was done by Urban Metrics, so an independent consultant, and essentially they looked at the feasibility analysis that was completed by MBLC and confirmed that the general approach and the findings of that feasibility analysis were appropriate and logical. So the results of all of this work that we've done to date is what forms the basis of the policy framework that we're proposing today. And my colleague Melissa Slupik, if she hasn't already, she will drop a link into the chat box, and that will take you to our project website where you can locate each of these documents. There's links for each of these on the right-hand side in the related links section. Okay, next slide, please. So I want to focus a little bit on the key findings of the market feasibility analysis, just to share some high-level conclusions with you. The analysis found that for most of our market areas that were tested, condominium projects show viability under an inclusionary zoning framework to varying degrees. Purpose-built rental projects, on the other hand, were mostly challenged under an inclusionary zoning scenario. And we recognize that condominium projects are, in fact, already a stronger market than rental projects, even without inclusionary zoning requirements. That's just the case for Mississauga and in general. Another key finding was that we need an approach that recognizes the uniqueness of all of our sub-market areas across the city. So a one-size-fits-all approach isn't going to work. The 25-year affordability term that we tested was generally found to be viable. There is some uncertainty around longer affordability terms, and that's something that we're continuing to investigate, more so from the administration side of inclusionary zoning, wanting to ensure that we understand the implications of how costs change over time as the building ages and gets older and those individual units get older. And finally, that it's important that we allow the market time to adjust. So we're going to take the approach of phasing in or scaling up our requirements over time. And this allows the market to react to the new changes to the regulations or introduction of the regulations, and then we can scale them up over time. And these findings, again, were confirmed by that peer review and are what form the basis of our policy directions today. Next slide, please. So the proposed policy directions that we're sharing today will answer these main questions that you see on the screen before you. So what are the goals or principles of inclusionary zoning? To which size and type of project should inclusionary zoning apply? How much of each development should be affordable and in which locations around the city? And finally, how long should the units stay affordable for? We'll also be sharing some other ideas about policy directions. Next slide, please. Okay, let's get into the juicy bits and review those policy directions. Next slide, thank you. So first, we're proposing some principles to guide development of policies and regulations for inclusionary zoning. To start off, we want to strive to achieve mixed income communities where there are housing options for people and households of various socioeconomic backgrounds. We also want to generate supply and the right supply of housing, so that means affordable supply. But at the same time, we want our policy framework to be balanced. So we want to avoid creating any unintended impacts on the housing market. And an example of that might be introducing onerous requirements that cause a project to be delayed or canceled. So we want to make sure we're striking that balance. We also know there's tremendous expertise in our community already when it comes to housing and affordable housing, and we want to leverage and utilize that expertise from all of our stakeholders. So that includes our nonprofit housing providers, our advocacy groups, residents, landowners, and private developers, and the various levels of government. And finally, it's important to recognize that, again, inclusionary zoning is just one tool in our housing toolkit. It will not solve all of our housing issues. And for that reason, it needs to be used in conjunction with a suite of other tools that can impact housing affordability. And we're looking to do that. Next slide, please. So in terms of the type of project that should be subject to inclusionary zoning, we're proposing to establish some criteria. The first is the project type and tenure. So tenure just means, is it ownership or rental? We're proposing that projects proposing 50 or more ownership units would be subject to inclusionary zoning. So again, our purpose-built rental market is not as strong as our ownership market. And we believe that once this market becomes more established and we're seeing a bit of an uptick in interest for purpose-built rental developments, at that time we can reconsider inclusionary zoning. So we can revisit our policy framework. It's important to note, though, that inclusionary zoning can very well still result in affordable housing units. And that's because developers of condominium ownership projects can address their requirement by providing affordable rental units in their buildings. And then the 50 unit threshold will exempt some smaller mid-rise developments that might be particularly financially challenged to address inclusionary zoning requirements. The second criteria to guide when inclusionary zoning is required is the location. So we're proposing inclusionary zoning in our market areas that show good viability under an inclusionary zoning scenario. So this includes here Ontario Street between Port Credit, so at the water's edge, all the way up to Bristol MTSA, which is just north of Eglinton. And then Dundas Street, all of the MTSAs along Dundas Street, Clarkson GO Station MTSA, the 9th Line MTSAs, so that's Derry and Britannia, as well as Lakeshore Road East, and that's 3 MTSAs that are mainly east of Cawthra towards the eastern city limit. And there are some MTSAs noted here where there are lands designated employment, not residential. We certainly recognize that and just want to make it very clear that only where residential uses are permitted or are being sought will inclusionary zoning be required. And this study here, this inclusionary zoning study, isn't making any suggestions about potential conversions of employment land. That work is under a separate umbrella. Next slide, please. So here's an example to help you visualize how this first criteria policy would work. There's 3 different buildings here that are different sizes and they're proposing different tenures. So the yellow squares, so each project represents a building, and the yellow squares are market priced ownership units. The purple squares are market priced rental units. So in project 1, this project is proposing 20 ownership units. It falls below that 50 unit threshold, so inclusionary zoning would not be applicable here. For project 2, it hits that 50 unit threshold, but they're proposing rental units in this project, so inclusionary zoning would not be applicable. And then for project 3, it's proposing 50 ownership units, so it hits both criteria, and therefore the developer would be required to deliver some affordable housing units. So hopefully that helps to visualize. Okay, next slide, please. How much of the building should be affordable? So this is also called the set-aside rate. It is defined as the percentage of the building area that's required to be affordable. Today we're proposing set-aside rates that range from 5 to 10%, depending on the strength of and location of the market area, as well as the land use planning framework. So these rates, again, stem from the results of the market analysis and what was feasible in that market analysis. For here, Ontario Street, we're proposing 10% as the set-aside rate. This is our strongest market area. Then for Dundas Street, not quite as strong as here, Ontario, we're proposing a set-aside rate of 7%. For Lakeshore Road East and 9th Line MTSAs, we're proposing 5%, and Clarkson GO Station a range from 5 to 10% for this area. And I also want to point out that we're proposing to phase in these rates over a period of time. So this means that the initial rates that we see when IZ first takes effect, hopefully towards the end of 2022, will be lower than this, and we'll scale them up over a period of 1 or more years. For example, Toronto recently adopted their inclusionary zoning policy framework, and they're phasing their rates up by 0.5% to 2% every year until 2030. Next slide, please. So here's an example of how the set-aside rate calculation works. We've got 2 projects here. The first project is in Port Credit, MTSA, and it's proposing, excuse me, I'll just point out that the yellow squares represent market ownership units and the pink squares represent affordable units. So for project 1, in one of our stronger market areas, we're proposing a set-aside rate of 10%. The proposed residential area of the building is 140,000 square feet, so that equates to about 200 units. With that set-aside rate, that would mean that the affordable area required is 14,000 square feet, so about 20 units. Then for project 2, this is in Tompkin MTSA, that's along Dundas Street. The building is smaller. It's proposing a residential area of 42,000 square feet. That equates to about 60 units, and with a set-aside rate of 7%, that would equate to about almost 3,000 square feet of affordable area, which is about 4 units. These are all sample numbers here, just to point that out. Okay, that's it. Next slide, please. So staff are proposing that units stay affordable for a minimum period of 25 years. And we say minimum because we are, again, looking at exploring a longer affordability term, but we really want to understand the implications of that in terms of state of good repair and condominium fees and how those fees increase over a period of time. Next slide, please. The affordable rent rate that we're proposing is pursuant to the provincial definition of affordable rental housing. So for Mississauga, this is defined as 100% of our average market rent. Average market rent is collected by Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, CMHC, on an annual basis through their rental market survey. And the average market rent for all unit types in Mississauga it was 1,500. That was a value that was collected at the end of 2020. So we use that value, we carry it forward to 2021. And then the table that you see on the screen before you is average market rent broken down by unit type. So these are the rates that we're looking, these are sample numbers, of course, for 2021. We'd be updating these numbers on an annual basis as the new information comes in. And if we relate these numbers back to our renter households and what they can afford, this is generally affordable to our middle income renter households. So these units would need to stay affordable for the entire affordability term, with some possible allowances for increases such as inflation or administration costs. Next slide, please. So now the affordable purchase price, this is for ownership units, if those were to be the delivered affordable product in a development. We're proposing that purchase prices are affordable to our middle income households, and this is calculated by assuming that these households in our middle income category pay no more than 30% of their gross annual household income towards their shelter costs. We use a series of assumptions to come up with this number, including a down payment assumption, a stress test assumption, interest rates, and amortization period. And the prices for middle income households in the 2021 year ranged from 292,000 to 432,000. And again, those numbers would be updated annually. So we're proposing that these units would stay affordable for the entire affordability term. So we'd cap those prices, and that means that anytime a unit is sold, it would be capped, and there would be some possible allowance such as, again, inflation or administration costs. Next slide, please. So we're also investigating some other possible policy approaches to ensure a successful implementation of inclusionary zoning. In terms of suite mix, we want to ensure the creation of smaller and larger affordable units. We're suggesting at the minimum that the affordable suite mix should reflect the suite mix of the market component of the development, with some possible additional criteria. What we ultimately want to avoid is the provision of only small affordable units. We want to ensure that we're generating some affordable family size units as well. Staff are also considering scenarios where we might reduce set-aside requirements for certain circumstances that we might want to encourage because they'll result in a desirable outcome. So an example might be to reduce set-aside rates for projects that are offering affordable rental units or projects that are offering more deeply affordable units, so lower rent rates. It's also possible to allow developers to deliver their units in another off-site location. This is permitted under the Planning Act. There's some legislation around this. Generally, it has to be located not too far away from the development giving rise to the affordable housing requirement, and it also needs to be in an inclusionary zoning area as well. And we're also exploring some additional criteria that might be able to guide when that's appropriate, that off-site unit delivery occurs. In general, we want to encourage on-site unit delivery. We're proposing parking reductions for affordable units pursuant to the recommendations that are stemming from our citywide parking study. And reducing parking requirements would reduce the cost for developers, and it would also help us to achieve a more transit-oriented city. And finally, we're proposing exemptions that are basically in accordance with the provincial regulations. So that's nonprofit housing projects and basically projects that are under application with some more nuanced detail there. Next slide, please. So to close my presentation, I wanted to share some next steps involved in the inclusionary zoning project and how you can stay involved. Next slide. So we're back to the project timeline. Again, we're currently at the stage where we're sharing the proposed policy directions with you and working tonight to clarify our approach. We want to collect feedback tonight, but also through a follow-up survey, we'd like to collect feedback from you. And we also have some upcoming industry engagement. All of this feedback and information will fold into our draft policies and regulations. We're planning to bring those to Planning and Development Committee in May of 2022. And that will be a public meeting, a statutory public meeting. So that's another opportunity to share feedback. After that meeting, we'll make revisions to the framework and as appropriate, and then we'll return to committee and council for sharing our final recommended policies and inclusionary zoning bylaw. We'll continue to work on the implementation guidelines, which focus more so on how we will administer inclusionary zoning. And we're looking to, again, implement inclusionary zoning towards the end of 2022. So thanks very much for attending tonight's session. That concludes my portion of the discussion, but I'll turn it back over to Erin, and Erin's going to lead us through the remainder of the evening. Thank you.
So this is about the MTSAs. If you have your smartphone with you, great. If not, no worries. This will be on the project websites. But if you go onto the yellow QR code, this will lead you to the region's MTSA website. We've also put that a couple times in the chat, but if you wanted any additional information on what the region is doing with their MTSAs, go there. On the green QR code, that is our Have Your Say site for the MTSAs. There will be additional engagement that's going to be happening with MTSAs. So I do encourage you, open up the QR code, put your name in the sign up, and then you'll be notified of when these engagements happen. So it just makes it really easy for you to stay involved and to hear more information. Again, Bashar is your primary contact for that. And you can send him any questions through the website, or if you look at his, I'm wondering, Melissa, if you can just add his email contact into the chat so folks have that. And then I'm just going to go to the next additional resource. So next slide, please. So this is inclusionary zoning. Right now you've got a QR code, and that'll lead you to Have Your Say Mississauga website. Again, for those folks who have not signed up, just stay informed, put your email address in there. You'll be getting updates on when our next public meetings are. I just wanted to let you know that we will be having a statutory public meeting in May as per Catherine's comments, and that's another opportunity for you to really have some say, provide some feedback. We will be having some industry-led stakeholder sessions as well. So again, for those folks who are housing advocates or who are in the development world, we'll be having some opportunities to speak to you. So I'm just going to go to the next slide. I know we're on the edge right now. For those of you who are unable to speak, we have a survey right now. We will post that survey. It's true. I hope the Leafs are winning as well. Take a moment, open up your phone, and then you can start to fill out the survey. It's probably going to take you about 5 minutes, maybe a little bit less time, but we really just want to hear your priorities. And so based on the conversation tonight, this is a great place that you can add any additional comments. And while you're doing that, I'm going to start to thank everybody. So I, again, wanted to thank all the councillors who joined us tonight. It's really great to have you here. I know that some of you have to go right now because there is another public engagement that councillors are going to. So again, thank you for coming. I wanted to thank the regional staff for being here as well. I think we've got a lot of good feedback, and I know that we'll take that back and work together on these policies. A big shout out to Catherine and Bashar. You guys have been working so hard on this, and I want to say that the information you provided tonight was very thorough, and I feel like we really got a lot out of that. And then again, for those of you who don't know, there was a ton of background staff here that was keeping things going. So I always want to give a shout out to folks who were behind the session, keeping things rolling. I know, Simon, there was some issues with your computer, so I hope Amy was able to resolve that with you. You guys were great tonight. It's so nice when we have such like good conversations through like these virtual engagements. So really, just reiterating, we will have some more engagement on inclusionary zoning. This is an opportunity to learn about it tonight. We'll be posting this presentation on the website at a later date. Go to the website right now, read the reports, learn a little bit more about inclusionary zoning, post your comments. We're happy to hear them. And then we are targeting to have the draft final policies bylaws to be completed for July 2022. Again, that's our target. We'll be aiming for that. I want to thank you guys again for coming tonight. It's really important to have these dialogues with the community to make sure that you've heard everything. And that, yes, and so we will be taking all these comments back, we'll be considering them, and we'll be open again to hearing your feedback again. So we're going to be closing the presentation soon. I just want you all to take care these days. There's a lot going on in the world, and I really do appreciate you coming up tonight and having us hear your thoughts. Don't be shy to reach out to anyone here. Again, if you wanted to fill the participant survey, go ahead, but just take a moment to fill out the survey with your thoughts on the inclusionary zoning. So folks, we're going to shut the meeting now. I hope everyone had a great night, and we look forward to talking to you again soon.